BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today This Week podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, why some apples are early.
We had a fantastic spring, the fruit set brilliantly, and right now we're looking at beautiful colour and bountiful quantities.
The collapse of the UK's bioethanol production.
It absolutely baffles me, Charlotte. There's so many positives to that industry. I just cannot see the logic behind it.
And a rise in avian flu.
Now there is actually a separate strain that seems to be quite specialised in seabirds, and that is now causing outbreaks in poultry in the spring and the summer months.
More on all that later. Now, we've been talking salad every weekday morning at 5:45 on Farming Today this week, including the vexed question of peat. With increased understanding of peat extraction's climate and environmental costs, domestic gardeners often choose to avoid it. But removing peat from commercial salad production is proving problematic. And despite successive governments intending to ban peat from horticulture, there's currently no date set. Growers are battling to overcome practical issues with peat-free compost, particularly where salad crops are concerned. In Devon, the organic farmers, Riverford, are carrying out field trials in pursuit of a peat-free future. Our reporter Sarah Swadling met Riverford's sustainability researcher, Dr. Rebecca Bragg.
We're not that proud about using the amount of peat that we use. Lettuce that we use is grown in 80% peat at the moment. We've done this one project that's looking at completely getting rid of peat from the blocks that we grow our lettuce in, but we don't have that commercially available yet. So we are trialling growing some lettuce in reduced peat. So these lettuce have 70% peat in the blocks that they're grown in. We're comparing the weights of these lettuce heads to the lettuce heads that are grown in our usual blocks that contain 80% peat.
These lettuces, there are all different textures, all different colours, greens and reds, stretching away across the field. These will have started life initially at a nursery.
So these lettuce here that we've got growing in this field come from a nursery. They will have been sown into peat blocks until they're sort of ready to be planted out.
Why is it proving so difficult for commercial veg growers, whether conventional or organic, to remove peat from their systems?
We grow lettuce in blocks. Peat is really good for this because it goes through a machine. They push it through at a high force and it creates a structure that holds together really well. And you can pull the peat block out with the one seedling in very easily and then put it into the machine that we use. We need something that isn't using peat, that can hold this structure but also have a good level of nutrients in there.
If we pull back some of this plastic and have a scratch underneath, if I dig away at the base of this plant, this is our peat-free growing medium. And as you can see, it is really loose. It's very dusty.
And what sort of things would it be containing instead of peat?
It's like council waste, it's green waste. There'll be a bit of wood chip in there as well.
I'm with Ed Scott now, who's Polytunnel Operations Manager at Riverford.
So in front of us here, we've got a bay of tomatoes which are grown in a peat-free medium. We've been running this experiment for a couple of years now and getting slightly disappointing yields. We want to reduce and get rid of peat, so we're persevering with it. This year it's looking quite good actually, because as you can see here, we've got two bays right beside each other, planted a day apart. And when they came in, they were pretty much the same size. And you can see our peat-free ones are looking slightly bigger than the control, which have their peat blocks. The ones grown in peat-free do tend to be a bit slower to take off, and I think it's just down to lower nutrient content in the peat-free medium. The plant nursery who raises these tomatoes from seed for us sowed the peat-free ones a little bit earlier. The idea being when they arrive with us, they'll be the same height. And actually that seems to have worked really well.
For tomatoes, are there commercial peat-free blends of growing medium that you're able to use?
For this one, we have used a commercial blend. The problem we generally have with peat-free medium is that it's quite a loose matrix. So again, in the field, that's a real problem because we're planting by machine. In the tunnels, they're bigger plants and we're planting them by hand. So actually, that's not the issue.
Do you think it's imminent that a business like Riverford would be able to successfully move away from using peat?
I'd say within 5 years, we should be able to be 100% peat-free. And if not, it would be disappointing.
Ed Scott at Riverford. More on salad on BBC Sounds. Just search for Farming Today. 2025 will live long in farmers' memories, and not in a good way. As we've reported, a record-breaking wet winter, followed by a record-breaking dry spring, has meant reduced yields of cereal crops and has also affected quality. But a smaller supply of UK grain hasn't led to higher prices. Anything but. Grain markets are on a downward slide. And the government's decision last week not to offer a rescue package to two plants producing bioethanol for greener petrol is a cause for further worry. The plants have been rendered economically unviable by the US trade deal, which removed tariffs from bioethanol imports from the States. Jamie Burrows farms in Hertfordshire and Norfolk, and he's also chair of the National Farmers Union's Combinable Crops Board. He reflected on the economics of the harvest, the third difficult year in a row.
Wheat is probably down 40, £50 a tonne from this time last year. Barley would be about the same. So we're a long way down. And the real problem is, it is just a global commodity. And, just because we've had a poor harvest here doesn't mean that it will reflect the price that we get paid for it. We're producing a global commodity. And actually the value of the US dollar is far more relevant to the price we get paid for our grain than our weather conditions.
Many people will be really surprised that actually currency movements are more impactful here than the weather and the yield in a British field.
If the dollar is down, then that's cheap to buy and export around the world. So that has a knock-on effect on the grain movements around the world, and it makes ours expensive, effectively.
What impact will the closure of bioethanol plants in the UK make? The government decided last week not to intervene. It says that wouldn't provide value for money for the taxpayer.
It absolutely baffles me, Charlotte. There's so many positives to that industry. I just cannot see the logic behind it. But our figures at the moment show that pretty much Midlands upwards, we're seeing a price increase of £10 to £15 a tonne for farmers growing wheat in that area going into Vivergo.
So logically then, once the bioethanol plant closes, you also lose that premium.
Yeah, absolutely. So farmers in the north, and as I say, down to the North Midlands, that the price they get now will drop from where it is.
Is there anything farmers can do now, both with that, the yield, the quality, all the things that we've just talked about, to play the markets and hope to get a better price?
You're very limited in what you can do. I mean, some of us look to selling grain for next harvest on the futures market. If I'd have sold 2/3 of my crop at what were quite good prices being offered this time last year, I would be concerned whether I'd have enough in the shed to cover those commitments. And that's the problem with the weather being so unpredictable now. You can't really sell too much ahead because you don't know what you're going to have.
What could the longer term impact of this be now?
You've talked to enough farmers over the years. Their first reaction is, well, we'll just get this year out of the way and we'll have another go. And I'm not hearing that. Last couple of weeks, I've not heard that. I've heard good, capable, forward-thinking farmers with forward-thinking businesses, profitable businesses, turn around to me and say, I'm working out my exit strategy.
Really?
Yeah. When you look at the backdrop of, I'm sure we don't want to get into it now, but, with the backdrop of IHT and everything else, you do think, what else can we have thrown at us? As an arable farmer at the moment, trying to work out what the future will hold is it's a very difficult one to understand where we go from here.
Jamie Burrows there. And IHT, inheritance tax. We're not talking about it today, but I'm sure we will be in the future. Well, this week, the Vivergo bioethanol plant on the Humber near Hull stopped production and started laying off staff. A separate business, Ensus on Teesside, is continuing for now. It produces bioethanol and also carbon dioxide, which is used in abattoirs and the food industry. Vivergo, owned by Associated British Foods, bought around 1 million tonnes of wheat a year to distill into bioethanol. and it also produced large quantities of cattle feed as a byproduct. Some critics of the government's decision not to support bioethanol production say it should be playing a vital role in the UK's transition to clean energy. But Dr. Michael Short from the School of Chemistry and Chemical Engineering at the University of Surrey says the UK has been dependent on American bioethanol for some time now.
Most of the bioethanol used in the UK is from the US. And the reason really is because the US has a very, very established bioethanol market there. They've been doing intensive agriculture of corn for many, many years at very large scale. They also have very large scale bioethanol plants and low energy prices and a lot of supportive subsidies. And so that makes their ethanol very competitive. The UK is a small place, smaller land availability, and also we have very high energy prices. Competition already was quite tight for these companies to be able to be competitive against the US and Brazil as well.
When it comes to whether the government should have supported Vivergo, though, I mean, they say that they've taken the difficult decision not to offer direct funding because it wouldn't provide value for the taxpayer or solve the long-term problems that the industry faces. What do you make of that?
It is a tough one just because of the fact that the bioethanol coming in is quite a bit cheaper than the bioethanol that we're producing here. However, if the government were to put in some other mechanisms that are maybe more around carbon emissions rather than purely around subsidy rates and costs, this could help. So, for example, the bioethanol coming in from the States does have a higher carbon footprint than the bioethanol that we're creating in the UK. In terms of energy security, absolutely, having your own supply of this stuff does add to resilience. The UK government could have been looking at things like building reserves of bioethanol fuels, which they currently don't do as far as I'm aware. And, you know, these sorts of mechanisms could have helped sustain the industry without necessarily direct funding.
And how important is it going to be in the future as a fuel?
Ethanol is vital for sustainable aviation fuels, so SAF. You don't directly put ethanol into aviation fuels, but you can upgrade ethanol to kerosene, which you can put into aviation fuel to create very clean aviation fuel.
And of course, the bioethanol industry also produces, as a byproduct, carbon dioxide, doesn't it? And we do need carbon dioxide as a country.
Absolutely. And it also produces feed for animals. One of the byproducts is a feed for animals. The Vivergo plant didn't do CO2, I believe, as a product. They were planning on putting in CO2 capture for the fermentation process, but the other plant does have CO2 as a product stream still, so that may be a lifeline, partially because other large heavy industries that used to supply CO2 to the UK have gone offline in the last 5 years.
Dr. Michael Short from the University of Surrey talking there to Kaz Graham. The cider apple harvest has started already. Most apples are picked in the autumn, and even varieties which ripen early aren't usually ready yet. And the apple harvest looks likely to buck this year's trend and be good. Ali Kappa grows both cider and eating apples in Herefordshire and is chair of the producer group British Apples and Pears.
I think all the way through this year, every crop has reported a slightly earlier harvest, some more than others. And at the moment, trees are under stress. And when they're under stress, both fruit and leaf will fall.
Does that mean that the apples won't be as good as usual?
Right, let's talk about the crop in two ways. So let's talk about the eating apples. And the answer is no, they're going to be amazing. We've got a fabulous crop. We had a fantastic spring. The fruit set brilliantly. And right now we're looking at beautiful colour, great tasting fruit and bountiful quantities. From the middle of September, the shelves should be full of lovely, wonderful British apples. The cider apple crop is a little bit different. The peak harvest for cider apples is middle of October to middle of November. And right now, those apples are looking quite small, trees are under stress, and that's why on some of the earlier varieties, the apples are ready and they're falling. That said, for the peak crop, 6 weeks is a long time when it comes to the weather. So we could easily get the rainfall that the crop needs.
Are you concerned about these longer, hotter, drier spells?
So the eating apple crop is really well invested and many growers have got irrigation. We are getting some issues with abstraction licences that are being halted and removed. But trees, apple trees are amazing. You know, they're very resilient. I think if we see an issue from this year's stress and drought conditions, we will see it in next year's crop. Am I concerned about what we're seeing? Yes, but I'm trying to be as measured as possible because it's not as bad as many other European and Southern Hemisphere countries. Agriculture is experiencing climate change volatility, but here in the UK, that volatility is something which, with a bit of planning and a bit of investment, we can manage. What does it mean for apple growers? It is going to mean investment in winter storage reservoirs, in irrigation systems, and in varieties that will grow well in our slightly warmer climate. It is going to mean investment, and investment means better returns and more profit.
That's going to be the issue, isn't it? Because as we have discussed in years gone by, apple growers feel that they're not being paid enough, and certainly not being paid enough to spend the kind of money that you have just talked about.
Yeah, and I think what we're really being reminded of with climate change is that it has always been in the growing of fresh produce, of fruit and vegetables. It's been a high-risk crop. It's always a high-risk crop because you're up against the weather and you're growing a crop that is really valuable. It's very expensive to invest in. So high risk, high reward. And that ratio has gone a bit wonky with what we've seen with inflation. The growers don't mind taking the risk as long as the reward makes it worthwhile. And now, in order to make sure that the shopper, the retailer and the grower get the reward of a good crop, we will need to invest in making our crops a bit more climate resilient.
Ali Kappa. Now, avian flu, which we heard this week, is on the rise again. In England, new rules on game birds are being introduced after warnings of a heightened risk of the virus. The government says there have been more new cases, particularly in coastal areas and places with a significant number of shoots. The whole of Great Britain is an avian flu prevention zone, meaning that all bird keepers have to enforce strict hygiene standards and gatherings of birds remain banned. Game birds, like pheasants, can be released except in control zones around an outbreak and in protected areas of England, where a shoot needs a licence. English shoots will now have to introduce stricter biosecurity, for instance, cleaning and covering feed and water to protect them from wild bird droppings, which can spread the infection, disinfecting vehicles and keeping records of any visits. As we discussed on this programme last week, the RSPB says no game birds should be released this year because of the risks of them spreading the disease, while BASC, the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, says the licensing system isn't working and that shoots already take biosecurity very seriously. The UK's chief vet is Christine Middlemas.
We've seen an uptick in avian flu cases in the last few weeks. And the risk level where biosecurity is poor has increased back to medium. A number of the new outbreaks we've seen, quite a number have been in game birds. And following that, we've decided that we need to put in some additional measures specifically around game bird requirements and biosecurity. This particular strain of bird flu is very resilient, takes very little virus to create infection.
Given that, was it a mistake to allow the release of game birds this year?
Well, we allow activities based on the risk we're facing at the time, and when most of them were being released, we were down at low risk for both high and low biosecurity levels. We put in measures as the risk levels escalate, and we take them out as the risk levels reduce again, and these are assessed by our experts.
We heard from the RSPB here on Farming Today last week, saying that they thought that the release of game birds should be halted given the risks. Could they be saying, we told you so?
We use our experts assess the risk and we take our actions based on that. So I'm confident that when the risk was low, that's what it was assessed as. But movement of seabirds is starting to happen as they leave their nesting sites. Bridging species start being infected, and that's what's driven the risk back up again.
You're introducing these stricter biosecurity rules for shoots, although many of them will say they're doing much of it already.
Yes, that's true, and that's great, but we have found that not everybody is doing it, and so that's why we're bringing it into the avian influenza prevention zone to ensure that absolutely everybody is doing it.
At what point do you think you might have to bring free-range hens and so on back inside?
So we're looking at the localised risk for that. I don't think we're at the stage of considering it for England or across GB, but certainly we're keeping a close eye on East Anglia and the southwest. We look every week, our experts assess clusters of outbreaks and what might be linking them. We know that watercourses are critical in terms of the risk. So where we get a lot of kept birds around watercourses and we're seeing a cluster of infection, then absolutely that's often a trigger for a regionalised housing measure. We haven't got clear clusters indicating that yet, but it certainly is a measure that's at the forefront of our minds, and we may well step up to that.
The Chief Vet, Christine Middlemiss. Well, bird flu is usually associated with the winter and migratory birds. But as you may remember, seabirds were very badly hit back in 2022. And researchers say the H5N1 virus is again affecting them. A consortium of UK scientific organisations form FluMap, which is studying bird flu. Tom Peacock from one of them, the Pirbright Institute, says gulls are currently spreading the virus.
Whereas the winter outbreaks that we'd seen in the previous few years, they were mainly driven by migratory waterfowl, so ducks and geese and things like that. And that mainly coincided in the Northern Hemisphere with our winters as these birds would move to different areas. However, a couple of years ago, we saw establishment of these viruses in seabirds, so gulls and waders and things like that. People might remember that because of the big die-offs of, skuas and shearwaters and gannets in Scotland, for example. But what actually happened is that virus seemed to have changed slightly, and now there is actually a separate strain that seems to be quite specialised in these seabirds. And that is now causing outbreaks in poultry in the spring and the summer months rather than in the winter months. And that's probably because that virus reaches a peak in those species, the times of year where they nest in these huge colonies. And so a lot of the outbreaks that we've seen in Europe over the summer have been related to outbreaks probably from gulls rather than from ducks and geese.
Is that why we're seeing some of these outbreaks then in coastal areas? And what happens? Do you expect gulls just to be able to deal with it, or is this going to go on and on?
We think that coastal regions might be particularly prone to this. You're never that far away from a seagull in the UK. They get pretty far inland as well. And in terms of what happens in the future with this, we may see a pattern of this, going forwards, where every 2 or 3 years we see another summer outbreak alongside our normal winter outbreaks as well.
In the USA, bird flu's also been found in cattle. Why hasn't that happened here?
It's possible. There have been some small outbreaks in cattle in Europe and, including the UK. However, the unique thing about the US is the amount of movement of cattle. And this may have driven what would have started off as a very small localized outbreak into something that spread across the whole country.
Do you expect H5N1 to spread through species? Or do you think here it may stay in birds?
So there have been other outbreaks of non-avian species of H5N1 outside of cattle. So there were mink farm outbreaks in Finland and Spain a few years ago. And as well as this, probably one of the longest running mammalian outbreaks of H5N1 is in aquatic mammals, so sea lions and seals in South America, and most recently in the subantarctic and probably in the Antarctic as well. We've also seen seal outbreaks in the UK, but they seem sporadic.
What can we do? At the moment, we have restrictions and then they're relaxed and then maybe they come back again. Or in the long term, are we looking at a vaccine?
It's very, very difficult to control these outbreaks when they're so widespread in wildlife. You can't really control wildlife. However, we can control the amount of exposure these viruses have to our poultry through biosecurity. A number of countries are now starting to think about vaccination. There are challenges with this. For example, export markets. Some countries don't like birds to have been vaccinated if they're importing meat into their countries. However, that may be where we end up going over the next few years.
There has also been talk of gene editing, particularly some poultry, so that it's resistant.
Yes, maybe not in the short term, but that may be something we see going into the future.
Tom Peacock from the Pirbright Institute. And that's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Beatrice Fenton. And Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.